Okay, here we go. Good evening. It's 6:30. I'm going to call to order the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting for a joint session with the Zoning Board of Adjustments for Tuesday, January 16th. We do have a quorum present. The first item on the agenda for this evening is to approval of the minutes. To consider the minutes of the December 19, 2023 joint meeting with the Transportation Board. If there are no additions or corrections, may I have a motion, please?
Move to approve the Transportation Board and the Planning and Zoning Board minutes for December 19th.
Motion is by Karen.
Second.
Second is by Aram. Vote now. Motion passes 6-0. The next item this evening is for a regular hearing for the final plat of Palladium Round Grove Edition, Lot 1, Block A, on 2.844 acres out of the Luc Bourgeois Survey, abstract number 52, zoned Planned Development Multifamily 3 District, located at the northeast corner of East Round Grove Road and South Euchre Lane.
Good evening, Commissioners. This plat has been reviewed by staff. We have found several deficiencies that have been listed in the staff memo and on the attachment backup. We recommend tonight that the Planning and Zoning Commission disapprove the final plat of Palladium Round Grove Edition for the deficiencies listed and delegate to staff the authority to accept and approve the plat once those deficiencies are corrected. The approved plat would be brought back to the chair for signature.
Thank you. Commissioners, any questions for staff? No? Okay, may I have a motion, please?
Okay, motion to disapprove the final plat for the deficiencies listed above and delegate to staff the authority to accept and approve the plat once the listed deficiencies are corrected.
Motion is by Rick. Second is by Jack. Vote now. Motion passes 6-0. And the next item is another regular hearing. This is consideration of one alternative standard associated with screening requirements for a commercial amusement facility on approximately 3.175 acres out of the S.M. Hayden Survey, abstract number 537, zoned light industrial district. It's located on the east side of Barfneck Lane, approximately 1540 feet south of Midway Road, as requested by Robert Weigel and Endurance Development on behalf of Pathfinder Sports, LLC, the property owner.
Good evening. This item is to make a recommendation on the alternative standard request at 525 Barfneck Lane. The applicant plans to build an indoor cricket sports facility, which was recommended for approval for a special use permit by the Planning and Zoning Commission on September 5th and approved by City Council on September 18th. The engineering site plan for the property is currently under review by staff, where one alternative standard, which was not addressed in the SUP, was identified. The Unified Development Code, Article 7, Chapter 5, requires a Type 1 buffer consisting of a 6-foot masonry screening wall, a 10-foot landscape strip, and shade trees placed 50 feet apart on center between single-family residential and service uses. The alternative standard requested is to replace the required screening wall with an 8-foot board-on-board fence at the request of Michael Mahoney, the adjacent property owner. As approved the special use permit, the applicant will also exceed the landscape requirement on over 70% of the shared boundary. On the remaining northwestern portion of the boundary, the applicant is requesting to decrease the landscape buffer by 50% from 10 feet to 5 feet and eliminate the provision of shade trees. Staff has reviewed the requested alternative standard to find that it aligns with the purposes and intent of the Unified Development Code and Comprehensive Plan. Otherwise, the development meets all applicable standards and will have no adverse effect on adjacent properties. The modification requested has been kept to the minimum necessary to address the unique site conditions related to the proposed development. Staff recommends that the Planning and Zoning Commission recommend approval of the alternative standard as presented. Staff is here for any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have one question. Mr. Mahoney was both at the Planning and Zoning and council meetings in September. Does this alleviate his concerns in total, or is this, was this, because I know this is one of his biggest concerns, is this satisfy him?
I would not say that it alleviates his concerns in total.
Okay.
He had numerous concerns, but he did want a higher height of a fence, and was not as concerned with what the material was so much as the height.
Okay, thank you. Commissioners, any questions? on this?
One little nitpicky question. It's going to be a board-on-board wood privacy fence. So the applicant's going to be responsible for the staining and the upkeep and...
Correct, yes. It would be on the commercial cricket facility. It would be their fence. They would be maintaining it.
Question on the terminology, board on board. Does that mean there are not going to be any gaps, or is it the boards are going to be?
There will not be any gaps on the fence.
Yeah, so the way the board on board works is where you have the boards that slightly overlap, so that even as the wood shrinks, you don't get the gaps.
Okay.
Is there any requirement for steel posts, or is, I'm not familiar with the fencing ordinance.
The fencing ordinance does not require steel posts. That would be at the applicant's discretion what kind of posts they would want to use. As long as it's designed for fencing, it would be permitted. There is no requirement of steel posts. If that's something that you feel is important to this, it could be added as a condition of the alternative standard, since we are decreasing the materials from a masonry wall to a board-on-board wood fence.
I'm not sure if I would, not sure if I would say would demand it or ask that they be requested to do it, but I just want to make sure that the fence is, because of its use to separate land uses as opposed to a privacy screen, it needs to be a substantial fence. At least that's my read of the situation. I'd be happy to.
Also, on the southwestern portion of the fence, that for the majority of it, they've also added, which is already approved at the SUP, a 30-foot wide landscape buffer and more shade trees than we would require. The only portion where there isn't that extra landscape buffer is that north portion of the boundary, and the only thing on the other side of it is the driveway. So there won't be any buildings or development as well.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
Ryan?
Do we have a landscape plan by chance yet? Planting plan?
The ESP for this property is currently on the third round of comments, and so we're reviewing that right now. We should send those back out this Friday, but we've seen it, and they have a lot of landscaping, more than we require.
The landscaping occurs on the plan west side of this fence that we're seeing here?
Yes.
So that will exist between what I think is a barbed wire existing fence, is that correct?
Correct, and the planting will occur on the cricket property. They're not building the fence right on the property line. They've also set the fence into their property line a little bit, which is why there's not 30 feet between the fence and the building, but they will be planting the trees between the fence and the building.
So I like the 8-foot fence component. I do think that per Jack, I think we should specify which side the posts are exposed to. Generally, this is often a case in neighborhoods where the person's property that you're erecting it, the posts are facing internal and the finished side is facing the adjacent property for view, so that the neighbor sees what we see here on the right-hand side of this image is what I would recommend. The more specific information we can add here, I think the better, so that the adjacent neighbor is satisfied when the end result is actually installed. And then I am a little concerned with just that the offset is nice, and so the access for them to perform any maintenance or ground cover care between the property line and this fence, how is that accessible at this point?
The location of the fence was decided during discussions with the property owner and Mr. Mahoney, and part of the reason for moving it back off the property line is the existing detached garage on Mr. Mahoney's property was built slightly over the property line. And so this allows him to maintain his garage, and they will have to work out the maintenance of that area. But this was sort of, he didn't want it right on the property line, and they were discussing the issue of the garage and the setback, and this was the resolution that was achieved.
Okay, yeah, as long as he understands that that's likely to be his responsibility at this point, because the fence will make the illusion of the property line to some degree, even though it is not the property line. Okay. Other than that, I was just curious with the gate, is that also a board-on-board sliding gate like you'd see typically in the residential neighborhoods, or is it a wrought iron open style gate? Do we know?
I think that's probably a drawing error. I don't think they're going with a board-on-board solid gate.
Yeah, I was just a little concerned with some of the seclusion components to it or visual. So maybe just some further clarification there might be helpful. That's all I have.
So should we amend this alternative standard to add these items we've just pointed out before we take a vote here?
Yeah, so what I've noted is that we would be adding a condition that the gate is an open style material, that the posts are situated facing the Cricket property as opposed to Mr. Mahoney's property, and that we want to ensure that it is a board-on-board fence with a little bit of overlap so that there are no gaps.
Okay, and what about the steel posts? Did we?
I wasn't sure if that was something you all, but steel post was another item that was discussed. I wasn't sure if that was something we wanted to require or not.
I wouldn't want my recommendation to become cost prohibitive, but for the purpose of the fence, the substantial nature, I would feel like the steel might be better.
I would also point out that there's significant cost savings by going from a masonry fence to a wood fence. Yeah. So I think steel posts, especially with an 8-foot tall fence, are fairly standard.
Yeah, I mean, I was operating on the assumption it was going to be steel posts. That's pretty standard with.
Yeah, I have some recent experience with this, and I think 8-foot fence, I think you want to have a top cap like the image shows, and then I think generally they're at 6 foot on center galvanized posts to support that height, so.
Would that add significant cost, though, to the fence? I mean, they've agreed to this, right? Is this going to bring it back because now this guy's going to have to pay more money to put metal post in as opposed to board?
He's still going to be saving significantly from doing a masonry wall.
And it sounds like he understands that, so he's okay with this additional cost probably.
So we're not really throwing a monkey wrench in here by adding these conditions?
My guess is that most of these conditions were what were planned on anyway, even though we don't have the specific. Steel posts, again, are very standard, especially for an 8-foot fence.
So it's a good idea to make them,
Ryan brought up a good point. The picture is of a capped fence. Is there any way we can ensure that?
You may also add that as a condition if you so choose.
I would like to add that.
Yeah, I think the comment here is if the image is placed here, I think that's the expectation as a result of the image. So as long as they meet the intent of that image, I think everyone would be happy with it.
In my understanding, board-on-board is usually capped.
It should be, yes.
It should be, but just so we're all on the same page, I think that verbiage should probably be in there.
Yeah, it never hurts to be clear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Especially, I mean, just given the sensitive nature of Mr. Mahoney and his concerns, we want to be good stewards to him also. So.
Yeah, I've seen these fences with just the fascia applied, and over time it deteriorates a little bit easier. And one other thing just to point out, the east-west running fence, I actually think that the poles generally should be on the neighbor's property so that the driveway has the finished side out. Like that's, you know, again, typically of drive entrances and what side the finish faces is just something I think should be clarified to the neighbor up front.
Well, isn't that opposite of what we talked about? Putting them on
So
facing the Cricket side?
Yeah, like the east-west side of it, or sorry, the north and south, the drive entry, it would be, it's just typical of how these things are usually dealt with, but
It
like
would
I
be
said, I just think clarification from the ownership of exactly how they're going to do it so there's no, this thing doesn't get erected and then issues arise after that.
Yeah.
I'm impartial. I think it'd go either way on that east to west one, that shorter one, especially if it's going to have some shrubs or ground cover or something we haven't quite seen yet.
Yeah. I would say too, even though it's not typical because you have a driveway on both the north and south side of that fence, one for Mr. Mahoney and one for the Cricket Center, based on this history at this site, I would say to keep the posts on the Cricket side.
Yeah, I agree.
Can't hurt.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, any more discussion, questions? Okay, so making the motion for this alternative standard, we will add the conditions as we discussed. And if there's no more discussion, I'll entertain a motion now, please.
Okay, I move to recommend approval of the alternative standard with the conditions that we just discussed, mainly the steel post facing towards the Cricket side, it being capped, and
Steel posts.
steel post and steel post facing the Cricket facility, and the top cap,
What about and the gate open?
and the gate, an open gate.
Open gate, yeah, okay.
I think that's everything.
Does that cover them all, everybody?
Yeah?
I believe so,
All
yeah.
right, motion is by Aram. Second? By
Second.
Rick? Vote now? Motion passes 6-0, I'm sorry.
Commissioners, this item will be considered by the City Council on Monday, February the 5th, 2024 at 7 o'clock p.m. for a final decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Okay, at this time, the Zoning Board of Adjustments will take over and open their meeting.
I call to order Zoning Board of Adjustment and announce that a quorum is present at 6:45 p.m.
Good evening. My name is David Erb. I'm the Director of Finance here for the city. Along with me is Ashley Carlisle. She is the Budget Manager. We also have a third member of our team that wasn't able to make it today. Her name is Deanne Tompkins. She's now the Accounting Manager, and between the three of us, we were the administrative arm of this bond program, which we're going to make a presentation to you today. It is our pleasure to be before the Planning and Zoning Commission and the Zoning Board of Adjustments to share the results of the 2024 bond program, or the work that's been taken up to date, and then to take you where we're going to be going moving forward. This is the same presentation that we made to our City Council on December 4th. We have been asked to meet with the various boards and commissions for your information and to entertain any questions that you might have. So feel free to answer or ask any questions that you might have. So, like I said, we were going to talk about our bond program today. So what exactly is our bond program? For those of you that are not familiar with this, we go through this process about every 10 years. It's a 10-year program. We identify capital needs for the city, and then we determine the best ways that we would fund them. So again, it is the process to select projects to be funded primarily through the bond proceeds. And we also then will prepare for a bond election to obtain voter authority to issue debt. As you might know, or you may not know, the GO, general obligation bonds, require voter authority before we can issue those. So all the work that's been taken up to date is to gear up for the bond election, which is anticipated for May of this year. So to start, I'm just going to provide some background information on what a general obligation bond program is and why do programs exist. The general obligation bond program is primarily for identifying the capital needs, issuing debt, and having a method for paying that debt. So in addition to identifying the capital projects and the total dollar value that's needed or that's been recommended by staff, we also have to have a process for issuing that debt, which is that authority that we get from the voters. And then we also have to determine that we've got the capacity to pay back that debt over a period of time. So it's a quite involved process. We get bond counsel, our financial advisor. We start with the staff making the recommendations, city managers' input, take it to council, and then now we're sharing that information with the boards and commissions. Primarily, the general obligation bonds are one source. They're not the only source, but they are the primary source identified to fund these capital projects. And funding from other sources includes water and sewer, bond proceeds or cash or grants or bond programs that we might get from the county, for instance. And you'll hear a little bit more about that in the presentation. So why do bond programs exist? Primarily, again, provide the necessary funds to support high-cost projects. Some of the projects that we have are considerable as far as cost, and we just don't have the available funds on hand to support those. And if we were forced to save those funds over a period of time, we'd be constantly playing catch-up, because in addition to just the amount of time that it takes to fund those, with each passing year, there's going to be additional costs, price escalation. So we'd be constantly chasing ourselves. So this allows us to fund them in a very economical way when they're needed. For instance, the public safety building that you see going up on Main Street is one perfect example that we would not be able to fund with cash. It would just be cost prohibitive. Another reason why we have bond programs is to spread that cost over a period of time to those that are going to benefit from it. So it might be streets or buildings, facilities that we have. It's called intergenerational equity. So we're not going to saddle any one particular group of folks that are living here at a particular time, but we're going to spread that over the useful life of the asset. And so then everybody that gets to enjoy the use of that is also going to be paying for that asset. This is our typical blue ribbon cycle. In fact, this is a process that we followed going back as far as 1965. In the last year, when we were going through some old archives, we noticed a blue ribbon program from just 1965. And it spoke to the same process that we're using now, where we collect the information or the needs that are identified by staff. We seek public input. We create a blue ribbon committee that helps sort and prioritize those, and then we take it to council and then to the voters. So again, this is something I think that's been refined over the many years, and I think this being my first process that I've been involved in, I thought it was a very well-organized process, and I think the results speak to that. So right now, we are at the point where we've made our presentation to council. We're meeting with boards and commissions. We're going to educate and inform our residents and through our various commissions, and then we're going to take it to the vote for the voters. And then the projects will, the construction will ensue, and that's usually done over a 10-year period of time. One, we just wouldn't have the bandwidth and staff to get all the projects done in a shorter period of time, and we just need time to issue the debt over a period of time that allows us to support the repayment of that debt. So what has happened so far? This process actually started in September of 2022 with the departments identifying and presenting their capital needs to the city manager's office and the Blue Ribbon team. We put together information, and we presented that to the Blue Ribbon committee members. Now, there was a process for selecting those members. We have 8 members on that board that participated in the process. Over the next several months after the Blue Ribbon committee was identified, staff presented over 60 projects that involved water and sewer, that was related to streets, parks and recreation, public safety projects. There was a bus tour that was done as part of that, just so that the Blue Ribbon committee members and staff and city manager's office can get a feel for what's out there, and helps them just prioritize in their mind, where they see the greatest needs would be. final, not necessarily final, but a preliminary final recommendation was put together in May of 2023. And at that time, we took a break for the summer. We came back in September, reconvened, and we made a series of held a series of public input meetings, first with the ambassadors and then in 3 different locations in the city where we solicited input for the final program. Final recommendations again were made to council December 4th, and here we are right now presenting to the boards and commissions. We're going to take the bond propositions to council on February 5th, and then May 4th will be the election day. Between the date that the bond election is called and the May 4th election date, staff will be able to inform and educate our voters on the different propositions, answer any questions that they have, and again, take it to the voters on May 4th. So the advisory committee, as I mentioned earlier, had 8 members, has 8 members. Over that period of time that I've just shared, all attended 20 meetings, dedicated more than 40 hours during those meetings to discussion, hearing presentations, asking questions. They invested a ton of more time actually reviewing the materials that we had. So ultimately, we picked 24 projects, or they were selected between the Blue Ribbon Committee and City Manager's Office, that are represented in this very condensed packet. But as Karen will tell you, we provided 2 4-inch binders with over 1,000 pages of information that the members were asked to look through and help them, educate them on the projects that were being recommended, and then that helped in the decision-making process when it came time to prioritize the projects. This was not done in a vacuum, so it wasn't the fact of staff presenting projects to the city manager's office and then sending that out to the Blue Ribbon Committee to prioritize. We did have a community survey early on in the process asking them, any residents or interested parties, where they prioritized a bond program, what projects they were most interested in seeing with the bond program. So we used that as just one piece of information that we used to determine the final prioritization of the projects. We had the joint public input meetings that I had mentioned earlier. The first one with the ambassadors, and then we had at different locations throughout the city. We tried to make it locational available for folks, whether they were in the western part of the city, central, or on the east side, that they had access to a meeting there. I'm going to turn it over to Ashley, and she's going to take us through a number of slides related to the actual propositions and the projects that were being considered.
Thank you, Dave. As Dave mentioned, I am the new budget manager for the city of Lewisville, and I'm pleased to be before you tonight. I wanted to talk a little bit about the project prioritization and propositions. We had 68 projects that actually totaled over $1 billion that were submitted to the committee for review. These projects were selected based on infrastructure condition, existing planning efforts, and known impacts to project areas. Each of these projects was ranked on a specific set of criteria that you see in front of you. First criteria being transportation, circulation, and public safety. We also considered whether there was existing infrastructure located at these project sites. We looked at revitalization and balanced growth, quality of life, whether there were equity concerns in play. We also took a look at whether we had external funding sources that could help fund these projects, or if any of these projects had specific timing requirements. And then we took into account any special considerations as well. City staff and the Blue Ribbon Committee each ranked every single project individually. So we actually had a staff ranking and then a committee ranking, and we met to discuss those results, and we were actually pleasantly surprised to find out there were maybe 2 or 3 projects where we differed on our ranking. So it was fairly easy to fine-tune that recommendation. And then the Blue Ribbon Committee was able to, within the city's recommended bond capacity, select final projects to make the list. What you see in front of you here is those final 24 projects listed in priority order by amount. One item I wanted to note here is that we have since added on $1 million for public art. That total is not represented in these individual project costs, but we're going to talk about that in a little more detail here in the next few slides. These are the potential ballot propositions. These totals do include the allocation for public art. Proposition 1 is for $198.9 million for street improvements. Proposition 2 is for $47.9 million for parks, open space, and recreation improvements. And then Proposition 3 is for $16.6 million for public safety improvements. This is a list of the potential street improvement projects for Proposition 1. You'll see on some of these project titles in parentheses, we've got supplemental funding or construction funding. What that means is we have existing funding for these projects. We just need a little bit more to get us to that finish line. So you can see that, for example, in Corporate Drive. We also have several projects where we are entering into the second phase of those projects. For example, we've got the Mackenzie-Hembry neighborhood rehab, and then West College Street paving and drainage, as well as South Keeley Avenue. And then in addition to that, we've got other projects for South Charles Street, street infrastructure for the Vista Mall area, a connection near Purnell and Redbud that would connect this area to 121. It would remove the existing railroad crossing that's in that area. Northeast Old Town streets, and then street infrastructure for Lake Park. And here are the remaining potential projects for Proposition 1. You can see here Lewisville Valley 1, Valley 4, Valley Ridge Extension, and South Cowan Avenue all are listed here for construction funding. That means we already have some funding set aside for design and possibly part of construction. And then we've also got projects here listed for Huffines Boulevard, the second phase of South Mill Street, phases 1 and 2 of neighborhood rehab of Meadow Glen, and then this alley replacement program. I wanted to talk a little bit about that. So some of the street projects that you see here have funding included to repair or replace alleys that are in disrepair in those neighborhoods. This particular project would fund other alleys that are not already included in any of these projects. So this would function more as a citywide alley replacement program. Proposition 2 is for parks, open space, and recreation. The first project you see listed here is for our 10-minute walk to a park initiative. We have 23% of our residents that do not live within a 10-minute walk to a park. So in order to close that gap, we're looking at constructing some trails or other walkability connections to get them access to those areas. The Vista Ridge Park and Amphitheater project has some really interesting redesign features to it, including a miracle field, a boardwalk around a detention pond, and then over on the amphitheater site, possible grand lawn and performance stage. We also have funding set aside for park and trail improvements at Lake Park, and then trail construction in the Levee Improvement District. This particular project would just be phase 1 of this project. It would allow students that live in this area to have a safe route to school if they attend Rockbrook Elementary. We also have a project for land acquisition for parks and open space. If we want to close that gap for the 10-minute walk to a park, we'll have to acquire land for that, whether it's undeveloped or a developed parcel, to be able to get access to those 23% of residents that don't have access to a park within 10 minutes. And then lastly, we also have a trails corridor that we're looking at for the Castle Hills area. You can see that in the bottom image on this slide. For Proposition 3, this will be dedicated to public safety improvements. The first project you see listed here is a fire support building that will be located at Lake Park. I do want to specify this is not a fire station at the park. This is just a support building for days when they do training out at the lake, or if they're during the summer when they've got frequent calls out at the lake, this will be a support building for them to store their gear or do rehab. It's just essentially a base away from their station for them to support their operations. Then also at Lake Park, we have swim area safety improvements. I'm sure everyone in this room is aware that we had to close the swim beach last year due to safety concerns in the area. This project would help address some of those safety concerns. We also have a land purchase for Fire Station 4. We do have a Fire Station 4 that currently exists. We are looking at possibly relocating that station. It's a very tight piece of property. It's the only fire station that does not have drive-through bays. And with the amount of calls that district is receiving, we're looking at possibly adding a medic or an ambulance to that station as well. So this would give us the opportunity to look at land options. That station is about to be 40 years old. By the time this bond program finishes, it will be close to 50 years old. So it'll be time to start looking at a new station for the fire department. And then lastly, we have the animal shelter expansion. You can see this picture at the very bottom of your slide. The surgery suite that staff has access to is very, very small. Unfortunately, when they have animals come in for surgery or post-op, they're having to use any surface area available. And sometimes that includes the ground, as you can see here. So they really need an expanded surgery suite. And then on top of that, the kennels that are associated with dogs, large dogs in particular, have hit maximum capacity at a more frequent rate the last few years. And unfortunately, that has resulted in an increase in euthanization. So we're looking at expanding kennel space as well. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the public art component that I mentioned earlier. Public art is an allowable use of bond proceeds when it's included as part of a capital bond program. This has to be spelled out in the bond proposition language. Lewisville has done this before. We did this with our 2015 bond program. We've got some examples here for you. We had public art set aside for the Thrive Recreation Center. For our trail system, both of those have been completed. And then we also had some public art funding set aside for Corporate Drive. Unfortunately, due to cost escalation for that project, those funds had to be used towards construction. The 2021 bond program did not include a public art component. This was for the Joint Public Safety Complex. We have actually been able to utilize other non-bond fund sources for public art at this location. And then for our 2024 bond program, we are proposing $1 million in support of public art. This will be spread over 9 of the 24 projects. You can see those 9 projects listed here. About $400,000 will go towards the streets proposition, $400,000 towards the parks, open space, and recreation proposition, and then $200,000 for the public safety proposition for the animal shelter. What this chart shows you is the potential GO bond issuance by year. Essentially, we looked at when we thought these projects might occur, and we tried to even out the project cost over the course of this 10-year program. One thing you might notice here is that there's only 9 years represented. We're actually reserving that 10th year in case market timing or conditions indicate that we should shift the project timing to that 10th year. So we do have that as an option. So shifting gears a little bit, everything we've talked about up to this point has been the amount of the GO bond program, but those 24 projects actually cost more than the $263.4 million. In reality, they cost about $322.8 million, but because we have other supplemental funding sources, we've been able to reduce that amount. So what you see here is the 3 funding sources that we've been able to utilize. We've got about $23.5 million in Denton County bond funding, $10.3 million in 4B sales tax funding, and then $25.6 million in utility fund cash or revenue bonds. And that brings the total GO bond project cost down to the $263.4 million. This is just a breakdown of the projects where we will be utilizing that $23.5 million from Denton County. You can see here we've got about $6 million going to Corporate Drive, $5.2 million going to the Mackenzie-Hembry Neighborhood Rehab, $2.2 million going to South Keeley Avenue, $2.8 million going to South Charles Street, $5 million going to West College Street for paving and drainage, and then $2.3 million going to Huffines Boulevard. All of the $10.3 million in 4B sales tax funding will be dedicated to the Lake Park redevelopment project. And then for our utility fund, cash and bond funding, what you see here are projects that were listed in the streets proposition that have some sort of utility component to it. So it makes sense financially, and I'm sure on the resident side, if we're gonna tear up a street, we might as well go ahead and address the utility infrastructure at the same time, so we don't have to tear the street up twice. So that's what you see here. If there's a utility component associated with a street project, we will be using the utility fund to address those pieces of infrastructure. Okay, switching gears a little bit, we wanted to give you a status update on the 2015 bond program. There was a streets proposition very similar to what we're proposing for 2024. The top 3 projects in this list have been completed. Indian Oaks and North Mill are actually both in the bid award stage now. Holford's Prairie Road, South Keeley, College Street, and the Mackenzie and Hembry project have their designs complete, and then East College and the Jones-Keeley project are in design. Elm and Poydras Street has actually had its bid awarded since the time we have created this presentation, along with Civic Circle and Valley Parkway. North Cowan, Mill Street, Northwest Old Town, and East Jones are all currently in design at this point. And then everything that you see from Valley 4 all the way down to the end of the slide was funded recently, either with Series 2021, 2022, or 2023 bonds. All of those projects have a start date in either 2024 or 2025. There were propositions for parks and aquatics as well. We completed the Thrive Recreational Center with the aquatic center inside of it. We've also completed various trail designs, and we are in the development of those trails right now. The next 2 projects for Lake Park Day Use and Campground Pavilion, we are going to roll that into the master plan that was developed for Lake Park. So depending on the outcome of the 2024 bond election, we do have some funding set aside for that. If that passes, then we will roll the funding for these 2 items into that master plan for the redevelopment of that park. And then for the public safety proposition, we have completed the relocation of Fire Station 3. That station is now being used by the police department as a substation. And the police facility addition has now become the joint public safety complex that Dave mentioned earlier that's currently under construction. One thing I should have mentioned earlier, I apologize, is if you see a 21 in parentheses or a 24, that means that supplemental funding has been provided in another bond program. So for example, the public safety complex, we had a bond election for that in 2021. And then anything you see here with a 24 means we've also got funding set aside in the 2024 bond program. The 2021 bond program, as we've already discussed, is the Tittle McFadden Public Safety Complex. We issued those bonds in 2022 and 2023. Construction's currently in progress with an estimated completion date of spring 2025, possibly summer. And I'm going to turn it back over to Dave to finish this out. Thank you.
Okay, we're coming close to the end of the presentation here. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't provide a little historical information on where our tax rate has been, a little foundation there, and then the potential impacts to the property tax owner. Obviously, that was very much considered as we went through this process. One of the things that we started out with is consulting with our financial advisor to determine what our capacity was, what amount of bonds that we can issue at our current rate, and if we wanted to issue additional bonds, what would that impact be to the tax rate? So I'll provide some of that information to you now. This just gives a background of the tax rate that we've had over the past 10 years. And in fact, if you went back another 15 years, you would see pretty much the same thing. Our tax rate has not been more than 2 cents around the 44-cent mark. So as low as 43, as high as 45 cents. But I'll explain how we've been able to do that in a second. But historically, the City Council has been very successful in managing the tax rate and maintaining that tax rate, so then our property owners could know what to expect when it came time for their property taxes. I will note a couple things in this slide here. For fiscal year 23-24, this is information from the 2023 tax levy. Our rate actually dropped from 44.3 cents to 41.2 7 cents, 41.9 cents, excuse me. A lot of that had to do with the current property tax caps that are in place. A couple of years ago, the state legislature reduced the annual cap from one year to the next from 8% to 3%, or excuse me, 3.5%. So we ran against that cap, so we were required to lower that tax rate. The last column shows what the 1.5 cents additional worst case scenario to support the bonds that we intend to issue over the next 10 years, and that would be about 43.4 cents, which would still be lower than a tax rate that we've had going back since before 2003. One of the questions that came up during the public input meetings was, what's the impact on their property taxes? Well, we could provide some wide-ranging estimates here, but that also depends on what the tax rates were going to be for Denton County and Lewisville ISD overall. As you know, the state legislature just passed some increased exemptions for the school districts, and with the decrease in tax rates for both the city and Denton County, the homeowner is going to see almost a 16-cent decrease in their property tax rate. So we're thinking that that would provide some relief to the homeowners, and they would see a decrease in their property taxes depending on your circumstances and what your personal home values or property values had changed from year to year. This next slide is also something that came out of one of our public input meetings. We had a question that asked how much debt we currently had on the books, how quickly does it come off, do we use other sources to support that debt? And we have that information on this slide. So the total amount of general obligation debt, or CO, certificate of obligation debt, that we have on the books right now is $329.3 million. And you can see how that's broken out between the general obligation and certificates of obligation. Of that amount, we have almost $74 million that is supported by other revenue sources. So this is geo obligations that we are repaying that is not being repaid with property taxes. So we're lessening the burden on what the property tax owner is having to bear. So those revenue sources come from our 4B sales tax, our TERS tax revenue, and we have a portion that's supported by our utility funds. So again, almost 23% of the total debt is being repaid through alternate revenue sources. And we look for every opportunity that we can to limit the impact to the property tax owner. And we will also do things such as refunding debt or paying debt off early so we can reduce that impact. So our total ad valorem debt, or the debt that's paid from property taxes, a little under $256 million. These next two charts just show a couple things. One, what our tax rate's been since 2000, both as a total tax rate and the INS tax rate. The INS tax rate is the interest and sinking tax rate. That is the rate that generates the property taxes that support the repayment of debt. The blue line on the left-hand chart is the growth in our assessed values over the last 20 years. And you can see they've gone up from $4.1 billion to almost $19 billion over that period of time. We've benefited over the last couple of years with the annexation of Castle Hills. But even before that, we were seeing some good growth in our property values due to, I guess, the coordinated efforts, the joint efforts of the planning and economic development departments, recruiting businesses to come in and to generate new development. And I think you've probably seen that come across in your packets. So basically what we've been able to do is we've been able to live within our means with the property tax rate, maintain that level rate, live within the growth that's naturally occurring in our city. One thing that actually makes that quite remarkable is that chart on the right-hand side is CPI. You've been experiencing that yourselves and in your households, the growth of the cost of things. Well, the cities also have to deal with that. So we've been able to maintain level tax rates, stay within, live within our means with the natural growth of the assessed value and cover additional costs related to just price increases. So just a couple things to point out there. This is also a driver for the growth in our property tax value, is the new value that comes on our rolls every year. You can see going back to 2014, we've had as little as $130 million, not little, but as low as $130 million up to $720 million in new value added to our rolls. Even before last year's spike, we were averaging about $230 million of new growth every year. So that is another way that the city is able to reduce the burden on the property tax owner by spreading the tax bill across greater valuation. I would expect that growth to continue, maybe not at that $720 million level, but some strong level based on what we're seeing on the ground right now and what's being developed. We would expect some good growth over the next several years. So bottom line, what's the worst case scenario, the impact to the property tax owner by this bond program? We've determined that the median home value for a Lewisville home is a little over $351,000 based on our total bond package of $263.4 million and our current rate of the 41.9 cents. Our maximum increase, the worst case scenario that we would be required to support the bonds that we anticipate issuing would increase our tax rate to 43.4 cents. What is the impact to the homeowner on an annual basis? It's just over $52 a year or $4.39 monthly. I'll have you know that in 2015 we had a similar expectation that we could possibly increase the tax rate by 1.8 cents based on how we managed the issuance of the debt and market conditions. We were able to avoid any increase at all in the property tax rate over the 10-year period related to the 2015 bonds. So we're very confident that we will be able to avoid that 1.5 cent increase, but I think we would be, I'll say negligent, but remiss if we didn't include that information out there. So what's next? We're going to continue with a meeting with the various boards and commissions over the next several weeks. We're going to have a deadline to call the bond election by February 16th, but we're actually putting it on City Council agenda on February 5th. The voters are going to have an opportunity to vote on those propositions at the May 4th ballot. Before I answer any questions or open up to questions, this QR code will take you to web pages that we've built on the city's website. That's going to provide all the information on the projects that are being anticipated, the impacts, a number of just useful information for residents who become educated with the bond program. So with that ends our formal presentation, and Ashley and I will be here and happy to answer any questions. There's a lot of information. Feel free to go through the information. Do we have the contact information? We can provide contact information for you if you all want to ask any questions that maybe aren't coming to you right now, but you might have later. We'd be happy to answer any of those questions. Again, we're going to be Library Board tomorrow, Citizens University again on Thursday. We're going to be meeting with Old Town RDC next week and CDBG Board. So again, we're going to get the word out there. Okay. Well, thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think we have announcements.
We have no announcements for you this evening.
No announcements. Okay. So Pam, if you'd like to go ahead and adjourn.
Sure, I adjourn the Zoning Board of Adjustment.
Okay, and it's also time for our adjournment. May I have a motion, please?
Move to adjourn.
Motion by Karen,
Second.
second by Aram. Vote now. Motion passes 6-0. We are adjourned.